Sure, as though anything in the Middle East couldn't actually get more complicated. All of a sudden, something's gone skew-whiff in Syria. Obama, you could argue, kicked this off 12 years ago, looking for a regime change. Since then, we've had Russians involved, Turkey involved, Israel. It's going to be quite difficult to actually untangle what's going on, in fact, the direction that things are going to head in.
It's a bit strange, isn't it? But I'm not a believer in coincidences. So why has this happened now? Almost certainly this is because a lot of the rebel groups, they've been trying to get regime change, get rid of Bashar al-Assad, whose family have been in control for a sort of 5 decades, a brutal regime that's been in place. And of course, for many years, ever since the sort of the 2013 sort of major uprisings, it's been a bit of a tinderbox. But why now? Probably because the rebels would have seen that Russia has been distracted in Ukraine. And of course, Bashar al-Assad, his forces have been severely diminished because they rely on the forces out of Lebanon. So you've got Hamas, you've got Hezbollah. Hezbollah generally have been helping out Syria, but Hezbollah have been badly mauled. So all of a sudden you see a window of opportunity for these rebels. And I think that's what's happened, is they've just seized it. And frankly, who'd have thought, first of all, it would have happened. Secondly, it would have happened so quickly, literally in the space of days. Assad's regime has fallen. Syria is now in control of a completely separate group of people.
So I guess my first question is, why did the West have a sort of orchestrated support for the rebels from America to Europe? We had Angela Rayner saying on live TV that she supported the rebels. It didn't sound like she knew what she was actually talking about. So my guess is the line had been given to her. So we've got that on one side. Then we got the peculiar situation where Russians supporting Assad, Turkey, Erdogan, you'd have thought was a friend of Russia, and has seemingly betrayed him by actually supporting the rebels.
Well, I think what's been interesting is the international community has been sort of caught a little bit off guard, haven't they, by this news. So all of a sudden, you quote Angela Rayner. I think she's typical of a number of global leaders who've gone, we didn't want Assad in power, so therefore we support anybody that gets rid of them. The trouble is, HTS, that's sort of one of the groups that acted as a catalyst for up to 50 other groups to actually prevail. Some of those backed Al-Qaeda in the past. Some of them had their own agendas. Many of them, even HTS, as a terrorist group, according to UK. So how does anybody back? Who do people back to be the next government in place? And I think that's caught a lot of people by surprise. And I think my takeaway from this at the moment is there's a bit of a honeymoon period in Syria. People are celebrating the end of that brutal regime, the end of chemical weapons. You alluded to Obama, red lines, never transpired. But I think what's going to be most interesting is what follows next, because the jury's out as to what the next governance arrangement for Syria is going to be. And let's not forget, there's oil, there's gas, there's lots of natural resources in Syria. Wherever there's those, there's money. Wherever there's money, there's people looking for power.
And dirty deals. Well, yeah, absolutely. And America must be slightly worried because they've controlled a good chunk of the oil. That's not been good economically for Assad. America must be worried about how they're going to continue that control going into the future. So that's on the one hand. And then we've got the land grab that's going on. I'm not quite sure what Turkey's done, but Israel has certainly encroached a good distance into what I think was sort of no man's land, or what do they call it, demilitarized zone as well. Now, have they got enough? Are they going to stop where they are? Or is there more at play?
Yeah, and whether these are all connected or not, I mean, let's take them one at a time. So you talked about Israel, the area to the east of the Golan Heights, which is an area that Israel seized back in the 60s. So it's been occupied by Israel. But to the east of that, there's a buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria that used to be patrolled. There were agreements where Israel were not allowed into it. by all accounts, Israel has moved into that area. Now they've claimed it's because there's a vacuum at the moment, and therefore they don't want the terrorists, these groups that are now in control, capitalizing on this void. So Israel's moved into that area proactively. But Israel's also been bombing the hell out of, Syrian air bases, bomb dumps, the chemical weapons set up. Now, again, Israel turns around and says, we don't want these rebels, these terrorists, to have a military capability to use against us. The problem comes is that every nation is entitled to its own self-defense. And if you take away all of these weapons, you leave the whole place vulnerable. And that is a worry. So exactly what Israel's agenda here is not entirely clear.
And what about Turkey then? What do we think Turkey's plans are? Have we got a view on that?
Well, Turkey it has quite a long border with Syria, and for all sorts of reasons, Turkey wanted to try and make sure that border didn't become actually the edge of fighting. So they've been sponsoring some of the groups, HTS, one of the main groups, to try to keep the fighting and the problems away from the Turkish border. Now, if the rumours are to be believed, Turkey apparently said to HTS, don't do what you're planning to do. Don't try and overthrow Assad at the moment, because it will cause all sorts of friction in the region. Now, what the truth of that is, I'm afraid I will never know. But it does suit Turkey's agenda for HTS to now be in power, because it does create less friction along the border. And we're already seeing quite a lot of Syrians returning home. So there's a lot of people who had fled across the border who potentially will extend home. We've not seen any border violations from Turkey, so it doesn't look like Turkey's trying to do any form of land grab. But again, so many of these groups, one of the things in my military time, we used to study military history, and you look at some of these groups, and let's use the Taliban as an example. Different nations would support the Taliban. The Russians support, the Americans would support, if their interests were aligned at some stage. And of course, these groups in Syria are exactly the same. They've been backed by all sorts of countries. The fact that those groups also have their own agenda, but it suits them to wear a badge every now and again that says, I support Turkey, or I'm being flippant, but, in a way, as long as you get money and arms, if that helps you achieve your primary objective, then why wouldn't you? So it's not entirely clear at the moment what Turkey's objectives are, but it doesn't appear that they're making any sort of land grab at the moment.
One of the sides has been essentially wiped out, but nobody knows who the other side is. But I do. You know who it is? Turkey. Okay, Turkey's the one behind it. He's a very smart guy. They've wanted it for thousands of years, and he got it. And those people that went in are controlled by Turkey, and that's okay. It's another way to fight. But no, I don't think that I want to have our soldiers killed, but I don't think that will happen now anyway, because the one side's been decimated. Well, nobody knows what the final outcome is going to be in the region. Nobody knows who really the final. I believe it's Turkey, and I think Turkey is very smart. He's a very smart guy, and he's very tough. But Turkey did an unfriendly takeover.
No, okay, but it does start to explain why Erdogan was prepared to flip allegiances, or certainly temporarily. I mean, Putin's been a bit of a friend to Turkey. He got Erdogan out of a bit of a scrape some time ago. I think Russia's building a nuclear power station over there. Is that going to, this has all happened so quickly, I guess Putin might be sitting there feeling a bit sort of pissed off.
He might be, but I think most nations operate in their own national interest. And I think we're seeing as, diplomatic relations around the world may have some niceties around them. But frankly, if that means you're going to hack off your neighbours every now and again, I think Turkey was much more focused on its border. But if you turn to Russia now, in effect, Russia provided the Assad with his air power, because Assad didn't have any decent military. They were all conscript, very badly trained, badly motivated, badly equipped. So Russia, in any of the uprisings, has always used its air power to bomb indiscriminately civilians, military, whoever cares, as part of the Assad regime. And as a result of that, Assad gave Russia the chance to have an air base and a Tartia, a maritime base, and Latakia, an air base, basically for free. A long lease for free. Gave them Russia a Mediterranean launch point. But then all of a sudden you go, okay, so now that Turkey-enabled groups have taken over Assad, Russia, by all accounts, is desperately keen to try and maintain those bases, and apparently is in negotiations with these rebel groups. But the rebel groups will have seen Russia bombing the hell out of.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I mean, are they going to be happy for the Russians to stay?
Well, if you're going to be pragmatic about it, they like you were saying earlier, they might negotiate. There's a trade somewhere to be done. But Russia, they don't have many bases outside of Russia. It's very few, a handful. So losing two, where these are sort of, as you say, quite strategic staging posts, not great.
No, and again, you're into the grand politics then, because I don't know behind the scenes. You've got American influence to the north of Syria that been conducting a load of bombing up there. The Royal Air Force has been involved since 2014 in bombing in the north of Syria. And if you the patchwork, we tend to think of Syria as a single country. It is, but there are lots of different groups running different parts of it with different international agendas. And I think at times like this, it'll be really interesting to see whether HTS can actually smoothly take control, whether they actually will represent a form of democracy, or whether a form of Islamic control will settle in. Will those freedoms develop? Will Syria actually realise its full potential? It has some great wealth, great potential, but there's also so many agendas for so many. And just imagine you're one of these groups. You've been fighting all your life for trying, and you get money and arms from whatever. Suddenly, you've made an alliance and you've prevailed. But your aims and your boss's aims and the next group's aims are all going to be slightly different.
Well, at least you want to share a seat at the table.
Yeah, a seat at the table, a share of the money, some influence. And I think that's going to prove to be a lot more difficult than it might at first appear. And I think that's why you're seeing Turkey, Israel, America, the UK, Russia, all having a bit of a view and being a bit cautious about what the future might hold.
So watch this space.
I think so.
So Sean, we've got a new Sec Gen for NATO, Mark Rutte, been in post a couple of months. He's starting to, speak up quite forthrightly. Is the language sort of consistent with what's been going on, or is there some new diplomacy coming into play?
It's been an interesting few weeks, I think, particularly for the new Sec Gen, because generally speaking, these positions are fairly measured. Some of the language, though, he's using is not measured at all, and it seems to be very, very firmly aimed at NATO members and saying we're not ready. Here's what he had to say at a most recent news conference.
Our deterrence is good, for now. But it is tomorrow I'm worried about. We are not ready for what is coming our way in 4 to 5 years. Danger is moving towards us at full speed. We must not look the other way. We must face it. What is happening in Ukraine could happen here too. And regardless of the outcome of this war, we will not be safe in the future unless we are prepared to deal with danger. We can do that. We can prevent the next big war on NATO territory and preserve our way of life. This requires us all to be faster and fiercer. It is time to shift to a wartime mindset and turbocharge our defense production and defense spending.
Now, in effect, what he's saying is if NATO is going to be ready for the next war, it not only has to have its capabilities sorted, but it also has to have resolve. And I think one of the messages we're seeing from the most recent conflicts, particularly around Russia-Ukraine, is some questions about the resolve of Western nations. And what effectively he's saying, we've been involved in wars of choice for the last 30 years, which NATO has been fine. It provides a protective umbrella. But actually, we're not. We're probably into wars of national survival. And I wonder whether this is all a precursor, because he knows that President Trump is going to take over on the 20th of January. Trump has been a pretty vocal critic of NATO. And although, when Trump was first in power, only a third of NATO countries were spending their 2%, 2/3 were not. That's now gone up to a third. So 23 out of 32 now do pay their way. But still, you've got countries like Canada, who spends 1.4%. You've got Spain, 1.3%. Italy, 1.5%. There's still a lot of chunky NATO countries that are still not paying their way. And I think part of the subtext for all of this is Rutte effectively paving the way for when Trump arrives to say, come on, NATO, you need to step up to the plate.
Yeah, he has acknowledged that things are going to change, hasn't he?
He has, and I think there's also some numbers coming out, and it affects our own defence review, that say, is 2% enough? I mean, 2% is what we agreed during the sort of post-Cold War era when there was a peace dividend. We as a nation were spending more than 4% before at the end of the Cold War. Poland's gone up to 4.7%. Is actually 2% remotely close to being enough? And I think what he's turning around and saying is that rather than just being this sort of nice umbrella that America provides most of the security and we can just be members of it and muddle around, actually, and it's a big if Trump decides to focus American efforts on China and says, right, the rest of NATO, you European countries, need to focus on Russia because it's on your doorstep, you're going to feel the heat of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing Poland step up to the plate. And there's a lot of conversations now about how does Europe actually do its bit here? How does Europe dissuade Russia from continuing this aggression? Not today, tomorrow, but potentially in 5 years' time.
Well, especially if you're right on the border, because everybody's worried if you've got a border, it's not going to be frictionless.
No, and it's also, what are Russia's long-term ambitions? And I think there is a view that if you measure NATO's capability by mass, it's a dominant capability. It's got far more tanks, ships, aircraft than any potential adversary. But actually, that's where its strength is. Its weakness is that it's a committee. It's a loose alignment, and you're only as good as the weakest link. And politically, we've already seen, particularly with long-range weapons for Ukraine, some different views politically, different nervousness around it. And that has been a seam which Putin has exploited. He's realised there's weakness, and there's even been conversations, I mean, heresy to say, but Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, those three former Soviet Union states that are now part of NATO, there's questions asked, if Russia pushed into one of them, would the West really go to nuclear war on their behalf? Now, the answer, because of the nature of the deterrent, is of course it is. You do an attack against any member of NATO, it will be defining. You've got to put the seeds of doubt in any adversary that the cost of doing that will be far outweighed than the penalties. But already we're seeing that political waving in the breeze. That undermines the whole principle of deterrence. And that's what I think Mark Rutte's getting at.
Well, quite recently, he actually said, we are vulnerable. And the reason we're vulnerable is that everything takes too long.
Yeah, one of the things that you see when you're dealing with an autocracy, Putin has a meeting with himself and decides over a cup of coffee what he's going to do next. NATO with 32 countries, that can take months to agree what's going to happen. So that they call it an OODA loop, quick decision cycle. For Russia, for autocratic regimes like China, North Korea, Iran, that can happen really quickly. It cannot for NATO. That is a critical weakness of NATO, and that is something that NATO is going to have to address if it's going to remain a credible form, a credible institution to address the threats of the next few decades coming at us.
Sure, a Russian general has just been bumped off. Not to put too fine a point on it. He's done some pretty nasty stuff in the past, so you might argue it serves him right, but let's dig a bit deeper. Why do you think it happened, and maybe why now?
Yeah, so Igor Krylov, who's a lieutenant general, 3-star Russian in charge of sort of nuclear, biological, and chemical capability in Russia. Tuesday morning, first thing in the morning, he was leaving his residential apartment with his aide, and there was a loud explosion. 300 grams of what's believed to be TNT hidden in an electric bike exploded and killed both the general and his aide. Now, he was already indicted as being a war criminal by Kyiv, and there were suggestions that the Ukrainian Special Service had commissioned his death. It happened literally only 24 hours after the Ukrainians had, in absentia, charged this general with some war crimes. And by way of example, we don't hear much about chemical weapons use in the war in Ukraine.
Which is surprising.
It is surprising. Part of it, I suspect, is just the nature of the quantities and what type and the like. But just by putting it into context, we're not talking about one or two here. We're talking about nearly 5,000.
That's big news. That ought to be the number one topic on a classic media broadcast.
I agree. So doing something like that, which is, it's illegal. Trouble is with chemical weapons is they're completely indiscriminate. So, they'll kill just as many civilians, babies, children as they will soldiers. One of the reasons why they've been banned. So this individual getting taken out looks like a bit of a bad guy. There's some other details, though, coming out as we go, as we record this, one of which is that apparently it's an Uzbek has been captured. You can imagine this is only 4 miles away from the center of the Kremlin. So CCTV everywhere. Russia will have had no difficulty finding, who put the bike there and backtracking it. And they've now apparently got an Uzbek that is 29 years old, apparently is admitted to doing it, admitted that he was paid $100,000 by the Ukrainians to do it.
Really?
Yeah. That apparently, they had a rental car nearby with a camera set up inside it so that they could see when the general left his apartment, then use that to trigger the bombs. There's lots of different indications coming out. I have to say, when I first heard the story, I was incredibly skeptical about it because, really, if this was Ukraine trying to take out a single general, it's very risky. Is it Russia trying to take out a general because he stepped out of line? Generally, they take a bit of a jump out of a hotel window, don't they, rather than explosion.
Yeah, because you're going to catch other people, aren't you? But I know. I did actually see a film of this. I saw the two of them coming out of the hotel. Didn't see the bike going off, but I saw the aftermath. And, it was clearly, 300 grams, I don't know, doesn't look much, but actually did a hell of a lot of damage.
Yeah, you don't have to be that close to it to die, but obviously it depends on what it was packed around, if it's ball bearings or stuff like that as well. But I do think, what's interesting, I think, is that he's been taken out, but I think this will be more embarrassing to Putin than one might at first imagine. By all accounts, the elite in Moscow are largely protected from the war. By all accounts, the conscription tends not to focus on the landed gentry in Moscow and tends to be more focused at the people living in the provinces and out in the countryside. And therefore, Muscovites are largely going around their business as normal. But every now and again, a Ukrainian drone gets into to Moscow, and that attracts attention. Now you've got an explosion happening, taking out a senior general. That will all just remind Muscovites that they are involved in a war, and that will be unsettling for Putin.
Yeah. Well, you say it won't look good for Putin, sort of embarrassing. A scalp back home in Ukraine, if that's where it all started, looks good. It'll put everybody on notice as well. Life will just be a bit harder for people of any seniority.
Yeah, and I think for me, all of it, there's always a question of, this isn't the first time that Ukraine has taken out an individual. I think it's about the fourth occasion over the last 2.5, 3 years they've done something like this. The question is why, because it would have taken a hell of a lot of planning. It's very likely the individual that does it is going to get caught. God only knows what sort of pain and suffering they go through, when they're caught. So what's the actual objective? And part of it at the moment, I suspect, is that both sides are manoeuvring towards that 20th of January deadline when Trump is inaugurated. You know, Putin, despite it being in the middle of winter, is pushing really hard on the front line. We've got loads of reports this week about North Koreans dying in huge numbers. Why? Because apparently they're just running around in groups on the battlefield, which just sounds tragic, which provides a really easy target for the Ukrainians.
Turkey shoot.
I know, and but all of it, you know, it's the middle of winter. There's no foliage, so it's very difficult for anybody to hide. It's difficult to dig a trench because it's all solid. So the casualties, just surviving is difficult enough normally. All of this appears to be to get yourself in the best position possible for negotiation, and therefore taking out a general and just unsettling the Muscovites a bit might just again change the appetite back in Moscow for maybe being more supportive of the efforts to negotiate an end to this conflict.
Sean, the question of funding the Ukrainian war still rumbles on, with the Democratic government in the US still wanting to pile another 60 odd billion in. You've got the UK in smaller terms wanting to do it. You've got voices in EU saying the job isn't over. We need to see it through to the end, whatever that means. I mean, you know, quite why at this stage I'm baffled, because Trump is arriving in a couple of weeks' time, and Speaker Johnson has made it very clear that the funding that's been requested by the Biden administration is not going to happen, and it's not appropriate until the new president comes in. So, I mean, it's difficult to understand, to sort of unpick it politically as well.
No, it is. I mean, in a way, I think we're back into this logic that in our country, if you lose a vote, you're out, the next team is in, and it's all pretty seamless. In America, you know, the king is dead. Long live the king.
Wait a couple of months.
Yeah,
Long live the king.
Yeah, and it is a couple of months. And you've got this strange interregnum where inevitably you've got President Biden looking to protect his legacy. So he's trying to do everything possible he can to tie the hands of his successor. And he's got 2 months to do it. Meanwhile, you've got, you know, Trump, who is already alluding to what he's going to be focusing on.
You mean stating it absolutely, totally clearly?
Yeah. Well, you know, but without actually, you know, issuing the laws of the land. But you can just imagine how many memos he's scribbling out saying that on the 21st, he's going to be issuing. So the Trump effect.
Hundreds of executive orders.
Well,
I mean, it will happen as well.
It will happen. And therefore, you've got this really odd situation where, I mean, even to the point, it's which I'm not sure how helpful it is, but Trump is criticised this last week. We've got a bit of video clip of him, of the impact of him criticising the Biden administration's decision to send long-range missiles that can then be used into Russia.
Donald Trump has criticized Ukraine's use of U.S.-supplied missiles to attack deep into Russian territory, calling it crazy and saying that it escalates the conflict. He disagreed vehemently with sending missiles hundreds of miles deep into Russia and wondered why the United States is approving this. Trump also said that he has a plan to end the conflict, but didn't provide any details. He emphasized that a quick resolution to the almost 3-year-old war needs to happen.
Now, the Kremlin came back after this and praised President Trump for his wisdom.
Lovely, yeah.
And now clearly all of this is positioning ready for when he does come into power. He's very famously said, in 24 hours, I'll have sorted this war. Now, harsh reality, he won't be able to do that, I'm pretty confident. But there's no doubt that President Trump, that by then will be really keen to make sure that Putin is ready to talk, Zelenskyy is ready to talk, and see where that conversation goes. And I think where Trump's positioning himself is saying, I want to bring this war to an end. One thing that I do think, though, we don't talk much about, is that Trump isn't known for being weak. He will not want to be seen to be rolled over by Putin. And therefore, what levers has he got to force Putin to make concessions so that there is a, I'm not saying a just peace, but a peace in which, that it can be played back to the West as not being capitulating to, Putin's aims and objectives.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think ultimately one dimension of Trump, which is really clear, he uses his threats and his sort of hard power to ultimately try and get better trading relationships with countries, or as many as he possibly can. So it will be interesting, for example, to see who he invites to inauguration, and then who's prepared to actually turn up, because he's already full throttle on trading. He had a big session the other day at Mar-a-Lago. Some global CEO turned up and from the stage committed $100 billion in new money into America and 100,000 jobs. Trump got up, didn't actually thank the guy, said 100 billion, excuse me, 1,000 billion, 100 billion, let's make it 200 billion. The guy got back up and said, okay, 200 billion.
I'm thrilled to announce that SoftBank will be investing $100 billion in America, creating 100,000 American jobs at a minimum.
I would really like to celebrate the great victory of President Trump. And my confidence level to the economy of the United States has tremendously increased with his victory.
Would you make it $200 billion? He can actually, believe it or not, he can actually afford to do that. Would you do that?
Well, my promise is 100, but he's now asking to do more. I will try to make it happen.
That's good.
All right.
200. He'll make it happen. 200 billion investment.
So, slightly tongue-in-cheek from me, but what I think is behind some of these moves is to try and get better trading relationships as well.
I no doubt you're right. I mean, there were reports, weren't there, that Xi Jinping had been invited to the inauguration and he turned it down.
Yeah,
because
he turned it down, is he?
Yeah, because he knows full well that Trump's number one measure is to slap 20%, tariffs on Chinese goods.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever we may think of, Trump, it's going to be a change of mood in the White House. There's going to be a change of tempo, a change of approach. I try and avoid the political side of this, but I do think from a military perspective, we have been probably too wishy-washy, too lacking resolve, political resolve and intent. Why is that important? Because if you go all the way back to our nuclear deterrent, it's not just about capability, it's also about our intent, our resolve to use it should it need to be used. And that's just as powerful as the weapon itself. You've got to sow that seed of doubt. Well, it's pretty clear over the last few decades. You alluded the other day about Obama's red lines in Syria because of, weapons. We guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty, yet Russia moved into Crimea and we did nothing about it. When Russia invaded in 2022, actually we did nothing about it. There are consequences if you aren't robust, and I think Trump is going to reset that whole diplomacy. It's just going to be a really interesting ride along the way.
Yeah, the reality is that countries are also running out of money. They've got their own internal political issues. I mean, the UK has basically taken money from the farmers, have taken money from old age pensioners. They've now reneged on a promise for 3 to 4 million retired ladies who were promised compensation by the Labour government if they got into power. There's 3 to 4 million of those. Each of them was going to get at least £2,000 some time ago. That was gone up with inflation. That's approaching 10 billion. So, countries all over Europe are struggling politically with funds to then go and spend another 100 million in Ukraine. Politically is becoming increasingly difficult.
Yeah, I think it is. But for me, there's the slightly more difficult thing is that this committing money is one thing because you can turn that tap off pretty quickly if you want to. Ukraine doesn't need money at the moment; it needs weapons. Weapons means you have to invest in defense industry to actually create the capacity. And that has been very slow. The West has been very slow to do that. Now, if you are now thinking, you're a businessman, it might take a year and a lot of money to invest in order to create a factory that's going to generate those weapons. Based on the mood music today, based on what President Trump is saying, based on what President Zelensky's been saying, do you think there's a realistic prospect of the war coming to an end within the year? And if you think there is the possibility of that happening, you're not going to make the investments in the factories and the like, are you? It's going to be a completely nugatory, complete waste of money when all political parties across Europe, as you say, have lots of conflicting priorities. So I think it's less about the hard cash and it's more about the investment in weapons that, given the mood music that's happening at the moment, I suspect people are using the right mouth music. They want to sound supportive, but they're going to wait until late January to find out just how this is all going to play out. And you don't want to be wasting billions of pounds investing in a brand new weapons facility that within a few weeks might become completely redundant.
Yes. You know what, Sean? That's why you should be in charge.
Uh-oh.
Sean, here's two pictures side by side of Zelensky. The question is, spot the difference.
Yeah, the evident difference, I think where you're going with this, is that probably the whole time we've seen him, whether it's in Ukraine or internationally, he's been in army fatigues, hasn't he?
Yeah.
With his green, olive drab T-shirt, olive drab trousers. And even though international leaders are in jackets, ties, that's not been his attire. And it's been almost a uniform, hasn't it, for him?
Yeah, and he's a brilliant self-publicist. He's an actor. And you've got to hand it to him. He's stuck to his lines all the time. And he turns up in green and it says, I am at war, guys. Sorry, I'm at war.
Yeah, so what you picked out this because he's not in green anymore. What was your take on his change of colour?
Well, the black garb is him in his very famous recent Sky interview, which I thought was brilliant. It was a good bit of airing as well. My suspicion, because I don't think he does anything by chance. He didn't wake up in the dark and put the wrong gear on, right? Or his wife didn't say to him, I think you look better in black today, darling. So I think there's a reason behind it. And one of the possible reasons is I'm not at war. I'm at peace in my head. And that's the message I want to send to people who are looking at this interview.
Yeah, I mean, it could so easily just be a laundry thing, couldn't it?
I've only got one T-shirt.
I've run out of olive green T-shirts, and actually I've got some black ones. It might have been he got dressed in the dark, and he pulled on the wrong colour. But away from the flippancy, I think what I found interesting about that interview, though, was he just looked absolutely exhausted. 3 years, nearly 3 years of war have ravaged him. And if you look at it from the hope of the early couple of years where Ukraine hoped to push Russia out, they hoped that with the support of the West that this would all be just a bit of a blip in their history. You're now in a situation where Russia is on the front foot. There's lots of talk about Ukraine potentially being at breaking point, that they are struggling to find enough soldiers to meet their frontline commitments, that the economy is on its knees in Ukraine, and the public in Ukraine, by all accounts, are not universally against the war, but are wearying of the war and just want to see it over. All of that must be putting immense pressure onto President Zelenskyy, and he's now got to try and work out how to navigate his way through the next few weeks, because it's all very well, President Trump saying the war has got to end. Ultimately, it's Trump can sleep soundly at night at his Mar-a-Lago estate without having to worry about the bombs going off. Whereas Zelensky's got his countrymen dying in their thousands. He will not have a good night's sleep. He will be constantly worried about what the future holds for his country. And So I don't know. I think there is psychologically, to be a grand statesman, which is what Zelenskyy is going to have to do, if they are going to negotiate an end to this conflict, there'll be some awful decisions that have to be made. I do not envy President Zelenskyy at all. History will judge him unkindly, almost certainly whatever he does, because whatever he does, he's likely to lose territory, and there will be people saying, well, what was all of that about?
Yeah, quite. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's very cruel, isn't it? Because probably soon after the war ending, there'll be an election.
I think the positive ray of hope is that however this ends, and it's all very well for us to pontificate about it, you and I can enjoy a beer later and, we go home at the end of the day. Whereas, the war has to stop. It's been brutal. It's been savage. The price of this conflict has been immense. And
will
somehow
continue for a long time.
They've got to just find a way to navigate through to the end of it now.
Yeah. So Joe Biden's going to be gone in a few weeks. Is he going to scrabble around or make every effort to leave a peace legacy in the Middle East and work some magic over there so that before Trump actually takes over, Biden has achieved somewhat of a peace scenario?
This is a fascinating question from my perspective because ever since the 7th of October, Israel has effectively declared war against Hamas. And that war has extended to Hezbollah in the north, to the Houthis in the east, and has even resulted in activity in Syria. So Israel has been fighting on several fronts. And President-elect Trump has made no secret of the fact that there were no wars started in my time before, and I'm going to bring peace. And of course, the fact is that there is a ceasefire now with Hezbollah to the north. Hamas is largely a spent force. And therefore, you just imagine Biden will be so frustrated that he can't get peace over the line before he leaves, because otherwise Trump will claim credit for bringing peace to the Middle East, and that will infuriate Biden, absolutely infuriate him despite all of his efforts. So the question is, what enticements would Biden be prepared to offer to get that peace over the line? What would he be prepared to do for Netanyahu? And I'm hearing literally today, I got a series of calls saying, what are you doing over Christmas? Because if the ceasefire is announced, well, clearly it'll become high up in the news agenda. I know it's Christmas, but can you come in and be involved in the media coverage of it? So there's evidently a lot of work going on. They seem to be closer than ever. There's still, the big issue is the 100 hostages. Now, a good proportion of those are believed to be dead, but still apparently over 60 they believe are still alive. Will Hamas give up all those hostages? Because as soon as they've given them up, they've lose all leverage whatsoever. Will most of them get given up? And what does that ceasefire going to look like? And what does it mean for Israeli presence within Gaza? But the fascinating question is, what is Biden prepared to do? What behind the scenes deals is he going to be prepared to offer just to get it over the line before the 20th of January?
Yeah. Well, I think we could all understand Biden wanting to leave a peace legacy. Who wouldn't? You can see it from his point of view. If you look at it from the other side, from Netanyahu's point of view, what does he want to do? Does he want to do a deal with the man whose history, with whom he's not going to have a relationship with ever again? Maybe do a deal which will get overturned. I mean, if it involves money, then we can see what's happened with money to Ukraine at the moment. So maybe Netanyahu's thinking, I've got to live with Trump now, so maybe I'd sooner do a deal that's formulated by Trump. Maybe we make the Abraham Accord, which Trump initiated. Maybe we get that sort of finished and into full practice. So I know politically, I think this is a really complicated one. You probably think I'd be sort of fairly cynical about this, and I in a way, I'm cynical on the side of Netanyahu, not on the side of Biden, because I completely understand Biden's desire to do it. He's going to try and cut corners, which won't be great, because if you do that, he won't last. My big question is, where is Netanyahu, and who does he want to actually be seen to be sitting alongside, signing a historic bit of paper?
It's also, I think, you bring up a really good point, which is that the ceasefire, which everybody's talking about, is largely a symptom. It's not the disease. The disease is, what is the solution for the region?
Yeah.
And, you know, when the West all thought, America thought, the UK thought it was a two-state solution, Netanyahu's made very clear that that's not his preferred solution. And actually, therefore, you know, if President Trump inherits a sticky plaster solution, then at some stage it will erupt again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, as you say, is this the opportunity for Trump to go, right, Netanyahu, you've wreaked havoc, you have destroyed Hamas, you've got rid of Hezbollah up to the north for a generation. Surely this is the right time to now find an enduring peace. And actually, that could be a great legacy for Trump to actually get himself involved in, because not just America, but probably Saudi Arabia. We've discussed this before. You need to have, you know, not only an advocate for Israel, you also need an advocate for the Palestinian people, so that whatever the solution is becomes something where they can use Arab money to rebuild, but also create a safety, security, and prosperity and hope, not only for the Israelis, but also for the Palestinian people. And that is a massive challenge, but is Trump actually up for that?
Yeah, well said.